Welcome to the Breakdown with Birkenhoff for my YouTube, or the Breakdown with WB for my DLive, Trovo, or Twitch channels. And basically, our concept we're kind of discovering, or talking about today, is with police reform and what it might ultimately look like. And we talked a little bit previously about funding and the type of police there are. And there's ultimately local police. There's not Senate police, county police, your state police, your sheriff, and then you have kind of your I can't ever say that word, but you have that police too. And ultimately, there's only like 1% of people that have an oversight committee when it comes down to policing. And basically, an oversight committee is people that would do investigations on the police, are simply be more community minded towards what their community desires are, their community needs, whatever their necessary things might be. So you have those two ideas, those two styles, those two sort of approaches to policing. And the fact that we talked about a little bit earlier, the fact that the police is the police are the ones that do investigations on themselves is something that is rather suspicious. And I gave an example earlier of a paper. When you write a paper and you give it to your teacher, or maybe you give it to your boss for some sort of assignment that he was looking for financing, or whatever your career path might be, he takes that paper, or she takes that paper, and for a student, she'll put a grade on it. But for the boss, you might get some feedback and say, hey, this is what you need to do different, or hey, this is, what I was looking for. You did this part good, but I need a little bit more research on this section, or hey, you did perfect, thank you, and this is exactly what I was looking for. You have those kind of general concepts, those general ideas about how that's supposed to go. Now, if you take the policing example and add it to the schooling system, you would be the one who writes that paper, and you would be the one that assigns your own grade to that paper. So you could write a completely trash paper that you copied and pasted from Wikipedia and say, hey, this was the best paper I've ever written. I'm going to give myself 100 just because you want 100 for the class grade, and you're the one that gets to assign this grade because you are the person who gets to grade the paper because you are the investigation of your own paper. So it ultimately doesn't make that much sense that the police are the ones that are doing the investigations on themselves, because they're not necessarily going to want to give themselves a failing grade. And that just seems to make a lot of sense. I don't know why anybody would ever want to give themselves a failing grade when they have the option not to. So that is ultimately one kind of core issue that is wrong with policing. And we were also mentioning a little bit earlier that there's ultimately two frames of thoughts when it comes to police reform. You have the frame of the fact, or the idea, that it's only a few bad apples, and if we get rid of those few bad apples, we'll be able to change the system, because ultimately then it just comes down to hiring better people, or getting rid of the bad people and creating just an environment, or just an idea of good officers, or officers that maybe aren't as willing to resort to violence, or whatever it might necessarily be. But then you have the other approach, the other perspective, the other idea to police reform. The police reform needs to be much deeper. It needs to be really trying to solve an issue rather than simply take a road or a perspective that seems a lot more easier. So ultimately, the second approach sees police reform and sees how the police have their role, what the police's role is, as something that is bad and needs to change the entire system in order to fix the problem of police reform and police brutality, or whatever kind of major term you wanted to use for police. And we were also talking about a little bit earlier that it ultimately comes down to how people view the police. Because right now, especially after George Floyd and all the protests that happened, and many other people after George Floyd, and even really before George Floyd, the list goes on and on, People are simply looking at the police and their role and what they have in society and seeing them as not as good as a police force as they should be, or not as good as a control force. Because what the police are there to do is simply not create chaos and keep a system of order. And some people would argue that a little bit of fear towards the police is something that is good because it prevents people from doing a robbery or prevents people from doing a crime that they might do if police weren't necessarily there to control the system. And I was talking about the example of anarchy being the approach that there wouldn't be a police. And not everybody likes that idea because a lot of people see the police's role as something that keeps them safe. And so if you see the police's role as something that keeps them safe, a lot of people would not be the type to take justice into their own hands if we lived in a total anarchic type of style. There wouldn't be a lot of Batmans, as I said earlier, or vigilantes that would go out and seek that justice if someone did wrong for them, or whatever the strategy or idea would be for that topic. So that's kind of what we were mentioning a little bit earlier, but now that we're kind of all caught up, we will continue on with this next article about police reform and what it might look like. Now that we know kind of what police reform is, basically trying to change the police system, either through trying to get rid of what's bad about it, or maybe trying to restrict funding, or change where funding goes to, or in some type of police reform, they're saying give even more funding to the police so that they're able to implement strategies, implement training, implement body cameras, implement dash cameras, implement whatever technology that might make it a little easier for people to understand the full issue. And we're going to get to a video a little bit later where a guy talks about his 5 steps to how he sees police needing to reform and his debate and his strategy about what to do from there. But I don't want to necessarily ruin that video or ruin what he had to say, because he kind of introduced me to this topic, at least thinking about it a little bit more from his perspective. But we'll start with this article from W. Burr. And real quick, all of these articles are linked in my YouTube channel, The Breakdown with Birkenhoff, or my Discord, and you can join my Discord server on whatever you're listening to this, either on, or whatever platform you're listening to this from. My Discord servers are all linked there, or my Discord server is all linked there. So if you want to read any of these articles, or maybe you liked one of these articles and want to read it yourself, you can definitely check it out there and read it for yourself. Anyway, we'll continue on here. Police reform, how it works and what it might look like. And this is from W. Burr. William Riley, chief of Inkster Police Department, he was hired on the city Inkster to transform the Inkster police force after it settled a police brutality lawsuit in 2005. These are the guests, by the way. Actually, we'll skip the guests. You can go back and read the guests if you want. But we're going to go down to their actual changes here. Okay. The day that George Floyd cries for his mother reverberated across the country. I know I butchered that. Anyway, Chief William T. Riley III walked up to a group of his officers discussing the horror they had seen. So this talks about something that he also did. And real quick, also, I believe it was in Indianapolis or Minnesota, one of those cities, the police chief on one of these protests kneeled with the Black Lives Matter protesters. And a lot of people more on the right can't necessarily see it. Oh, hello, Smiley on Trovo. I think that's how you say this. You say you can't read. Oh, I don't know if you're... Yeah, hopefully you can see the actual text. I could definitely make it bigger if you need. I know I'm reading a lot from this stream, but I don't know if you caught what I was saying earlier. But essentially, this is a discussion or talk I'm having, trying to understand what police reform is and just trying to educate myself over the actual topic for police reform. So that's basically kind of what I was talking about there. We have from NPR here, and I'll finish my example. So you had a lot of people more in like the conservative type of movement, or more on the right, that were essentially saying that this is bad that the police chief was doing that because he's simply trying to endorse maybe the riots that were happening at the time, or trying to not stop these riots. And as a police chief, he needs to be more responsible for trying to put an end to the city burning, or trying to put an end to the violence that is happening. Blah, blah, blah. You have all these numerous examples. But I don't necessarily think that that is super educated of a response, because essentially by him taking a knee, he is not necessarily endorsing the riots and what were happening in the fact of burning and looting businesses, but rather supporting the movement. And you could argue that maybe the movement is the one that is pushing destruction of businesses, but I think that is a very, very far-fetched claim to make, and I don't think that that is necessarily a very well-educated claim to make either. So by him taking a knee with the protesters, he's not only supporting what these protesters are kind of wanting, he's saying that, look, as the police chief, as the person that is responsible for all of the police in this area and in this city, I know what happened with George Floyd, or I know what happened in the George Floyd incident, or any other incident you can name, that it was wrong. And I'm here to try to change. I'm here to try to fix that problem. I'm here. I understand your struggle, your ideas. I get what you're saying. I'm here with you, and I'm willing to listen to you, because ultimately a police officer, a police chief, a police program should be with their community. If you have a good relationship with your community, if you know your community well, if you serve your community right, people will be more likely to support the police and more likely to ultimately side with you on a certain incident if it were ever to happen. Because if you take a more community-minded police strategy, then you're more open to creating an atmosphere, a style, an approach that people are more willing to ultimately listen to police and to respect police. Because ultimately what it comes down to, as I was saying with perception earlier, I don't think that police are ultimately respected as much as they are and have recently been in the past. And it is a very interesting concept, because especially when you talked about maybe even before the LA riots, and I don't know exactly when those were right now off the top of my head, but even before then, the police were ultimately seen as a controlling factor, I don't really want to say movement, but police were ultimately seen as good and as doing what they should be doing. But after that happened, and many other racial instances after, it shaped the police force to ultimately be bad. And even when you have instances that become a little bit more challenging to the perspective, what I mean by that is if you have an incident where a black man gets shot or gets stabbed or gets over-tased or gets any sort of violent act, and it comes down to his word versus the police, people are way more likely to believe his words over the police words. And I think that is justified because of what we have seen. And it is something that is very, very interesting. And I don't think that would have happened in years and years past, where police were ultimately seen as good and respected by their community. So I think that that does need to be built back up if you want to fix this problem, because police respect has ultimately gone away. And you might be saying, well, police maybe shouldn't be respected. And that's a whole debate you could have. And that's when you start talking about kind of the second idea, that instead of just trying to get rid of maybe the few bad apples and take a more simple approach, you have to change the entire approach if you want to fix the system. So that was a way long explanation of just that one thing, but it came to my mind and something that I didn't really understand why people got mad at the police chief for doing, because ultimately he's just siding with what people are feeling and what people have felt for a long time. But we'll read this next one by NPR. Police reform legislation moves swiftly through New York State. New York's legislature moved swiftly Monday to pass a first wave of police reform legislation, including a ban on chokeholds, a prohibition on race-based profiling, and a measure of requiring police departments and courts to track arrest by race and ethnicity to keep identity patterns of bias. So that was a big one by NPR here, and we could spend a very long time also talking about this claim as well. After the incident with George Floyd, there was many police departments that came out and said that they were going to ban chokeholds and the style of chokehold, because one of the really interesting things that came out of the George Floyd incident was that what that officer was doing was in the training book. Now, what he was doing wasn't in the training book, in the matter that he was over his neck for way too long, and many other problems with the procedure and how he followed it. But the idea of what he was doing was the style of getting somebody detained and getting them arrested and getting the situation under control. Now, it doesn't say in the handbook to keep on his knee for 8 minutes and have him die. That is obviously not what was in the handbook. So they ultimately came down to people saying, I don't think that was a very smart procedure and training. Because although it doesn't say to do this for 8 minutes or to do this till the person is dying, it doesn't take it doesn't make sense. Let's put it this way. It just doesn't make sense why you would even have that as a style to seduce somebody. Because it also comes down to the perspective of he already had handcuffs on him. He already had these handcuffs, and he was already detained by the police at that point. Yes. See, ultimately, I think that whole incident came down to training. I don't think that those officers were properly trained in the situation. Actually, I know for a fact they weren't trained in what they were doing, because that should have never happened at all by any means. And I definitely don't want to necessarily defend the police in this matter, because I don't think what they did at all was right. And it's ultimately created the system that's happening now, and people becoming much more aware to how police do things, and the type of procedures that the police had. Now, the one thing you could say against that is if these procedures were properly handled, the situation never would have came to the instance where it did. But that is ultimately playing with good cards, and that's just what not happened. You're looking at the hindsight rather than what actually happened. So because of this incident and because of just the brutality of that situation, the many police departments came out and changed their core policies, such as chokeholds. And the second thing that they're talking about here is race-based profiling. And that is something you can spend an entire YouTube video talking on in itself. So I'm not necessarily going to spend too much time here. And ultimately, it comes down to if you see that as being... How do I say this? As the police, you need to make sure that you keep everything under control and chaos doesn't happen, or at least is very limited. The idea of thinking that everybody who creates chaos is of one color or of these colors is obviously racist. So the idea that you would have that procedure in place doesn't make much sense. And you could argue from maybe a statistical standpoint that they're more likely to commit this crime, or whites are more likely to do this, blacks are more likely to do this, therefore we need to do this as police to control the situations. And if you take a pure statistical analysis of it and live in that type of world, then maybe that is what you would do. But that's not the planet we live in today, and that's not what police should be doing. So the idea that police would have this type of profiling also doesn't particularly make much sense. I don't know if I necessarily explained myself too well there, but that is kind of my initial thoughts on that situation. One second here. I had to answer that real quick, but now we're back at it. So anybody who's maybe watching this now, I would definitely like to hear your thoughts on what you think about police reform and kind of your idea about how you might could fix the situation. I don't know if anybody's necessarily going to have the magical pill or the magical drug to be a magical drug in this case, but anyway, the magical idea to completely fix the situation. But it'll be interesting to hear kind of people's ideas about what they might see as simply doing to improve the situation. So we'll continue on a little bit more with some examples of what people have done in the past. I'm going to check YouTube real quick and make sure I haven't missed any comments. Okay, we look good on YouTube, so we'll continue on real quick. New York Times. Minneapolis will disseminate its police force, council members pledge. 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council, a veto-proof majority, pledged on Sunday to dismantle the police department, promising to create a new system of public safety in the city where law enforcement has been accused of racism. So this was the major incidents that made viral news, especially when the council then went out and tried to defund the police entirely and create a new police system. A lot of the right media was all going crazy because they were like, well, what is going to replace police? Because police are the ones that create this control. The police are the ones that keep everything in order. What's going to fix this? Before you dismantle the whole thing, before you just chop it all up and break it all up and blah, 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 you need to have something set in stone. You need to have a system so that you can fix the situation. Blah, 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 blah. So a lot of people were outraged more on the conservative side about what happened there. But ultimately, we don't know too much about what their style is or what they plan to do besides ultimately, I guess you could say regular policing or whatever word you want to use there. So it'll be interesting to see what comes from that, but it's a little bit too early to kind of know for sure exactly what is going to happen for Minneapolis when it comes to their defunding of police, or at least restricting the amount of funds that they get. This is by The Guardian again. Movement to defund the police gains unprecedented support across the U.S. The movement to defund police is gaining significant support across America, including from elected leaders as protesters over the killing of George Floyd sweep the nation. So, obviously, I don't think we need to talk much about that. We definitely have seen that come out through several months. We're going to go down a little bit and go to this political and CNN article. Democrats to unveil sweeping police reform bill as pressure mounts for action. Top Democrats will unveil a major police reform bill Monday morning as they seek to quickly respond to demands of protesters nationwide calling for racial justice after the killing of George Floyd. CNN. There's a growling call to defund the police, and here's what it means. There's a growling group of dissenters who believe America can survive without law enforcement as we know it, and Americans those dissenters believe may even be better off without it. So then it ultimately comes back to the anarchist style of government, or the anarchist style of whatever it might be, and that being the whole approach of if we get rid of the police as we know it, or essentially get rid of the police, what would replace it? And if you take a pure anarchist approach, somebody that wants to get rid of the police, you would oftentimes hear the argument that if you get rid of the police and you get rid of this ordered system, another thing would replace it. And that idea, I do think, has some truth to it, because I do think that if you get rid of the police, that something would ultimately replace it. And then you could argue, well, then you're not really getting rid of the police if the same sort of system is kind of replacing that. And that could be true. That could be true, but ultimately it then comes down to the idea of anarchy on if you like that style, because if you don't think that something's going to replace it, then it's going to get into ultimate chaos in a way, an ultimate area where everybody's kind of left up for themselves. And I don't know if a lot of people would feel comfortable having to defend for themselves, as I was mentioning a little bit earlier. And I don't think that people would ultimately like that too much. But we'll continue on with our next article. And you can definitely check out the other examples. We only included about half of the examples that they had in that particular article, so you can definitely check out that if you want to find out some more information on that for itself. I would highly recommend that. But this one is about 5 reforms that every police department should make, meaning that they should do it right now. And this is by the Institute for Policy Studies. The first is an idea we already talked about a little bit earlier in our video here, in our stream here, and that being the idea of community policing. And basically that is the style or approach that police should be responsible more in their community. The police chief or the police officers should respect their community, and therefore they would gain the respect of the community. And that might be as simple as police officers, when somebody's broken down, to stop and maybe put on their lights so that the car doesn't get crashed into, or help them fix a tire, or help them with some other sort of kind of need that doesn't ultimately come with the responsibility of being a police officer, but would look good for the police officers and look good for the community to respect the police officers. Because ultimately, if you see the police officers respecting you, or you see them respecting your neighbor, or respecting your friend, you might respect them back. And it's kind of a very basic, that's a very basic idea, really, and it's a very simple strategy if you're trying to ultimately gain respect. But we'll see what they have to say about community policing and their idea. Community policing is finding ways to optimize positive contact between police officers and community members. It was a key plank of the President Task Force on Policing. In part, it means taking police officers out of their offices and patrol cars and placing them on foot patrols throughout the community. That enables them to build a presence and personable connections with local community members before a crime or shooting happens. Camden, New Jersey is a great example of police culture shifting. For one intimation to one, initially builds a community ties. In 2012, Camden reached its peak murder rate that year. The city dissolved its police department and created a new one governed by the country. And most importantly, it took a new approach to policing neighborhoods haunted by crime. We are not going to do this by mentalizing streets, said Police Chief J. Scott Thomas. After 2 years of instituting community policing reforms, including hiring more officers, eliminating squad car patrols, knocking on doors to ask residents of their concerns, and housing neighborhoods, the events like push-up contests with youth, violent crime had decreased by over 20% just by the community involvement. So that is a really interesting concept, and as I was mentioning, we are going to get to that a little bit earlier when it comes to community policing, and also somebody mentioning that as a potential solution in a video, and he has some very good points about community policing and what that might be like. But we're going to go down to this article's next point. In uprisings from Baltimore to Ferguson, a major point of contention was highly militarized response by the police, who greeted nonviolent protests with military-grade weapons and vehicles. By the way, for anyone who was watching, I haven't seen any comments recently, but is the echo gone? There was a pretty bad echo earlier in this video. I just want to know if the echo is still there or not. I think I got rid of it when I listened to it earlier. But I would just want to make sure. But we'll continue on here. But shooting tear gas from the top of armored trucks doesn't really suggest that the local police are there to serve and protect. Those tactics noted by President Obama can sometimes give a feeling that there is an occupying force as opposed to a force that is part of the community that's protecting them and serving them. Many of these weapons are surplus equipment granted to local departments by federal government in the wake of Ferguson and Baltimore uprisings. President Obama announced a limited ban on transferring some types of military equipment to equip to local police departments. That ban should be expanded to include heavy-duty MRAV trucks and armored vehicles like Humvees, as well as M16 rifles, drones, flashbangs, and other non-lethal expensive tear gases. So that is being the whole idea or the whole approach, like I was mentioning, that simply by getting rid of some of these resources or not having as many grants or as much funding for the police could fix the situation. And the idea that every county has these big trucks and these big sort of like armored tanks might make sense if you're trying to, well, doesn't make sense. I mean, yes, there could be a bad situation in your county where you're going to need that, but does every county necessarily need these armored vehicles? Because you could rely on the county next to you, or maybe the county next to you, depending on how big the counties are, for that support. Because ultimately, it wouldn't be like you're having to wait that long for those vehicles. And the fact that every county has that amount of money that is getting spent is maybe mismanagement of money, because simply you could have less of these armored vehicles around your counties and still be able to support a situation like a mass shooting or some sort of very extreme situation that you don't necessarily see every day on the police force. But we'll continue on here. Appoint independent prosecutors. One way that police officers can begin to hold a more accountable for their actions is by ending the grand jury process for officers involved in shootings. In most jurisdictions, prosecutors ask grand juries to consider whatever they should be brought against a defendant, but the process is completely secret, and the evidence presented is completely at the discretion of the prosecutor, who may be sympathetic to the police. As one state writer explains, this amounts to using grand jurors as pawns for political cover. To exonerate officials may have a shot at unarmed suspects. Last year, California Governor Jerry Brown signed legislation that bans the use of grand jurors to decide whether police shootings should face criminal charges when they kill people in the line of duty. The high level of security involved in grand jury proceedings, the state argued, often led to non-violent incidents. Instead, these cases should be tried by independent prosecutors who don't have any connection to the local police force, that would send a strong message to communities most impacted by disappropriate police violence that police officers will be held accountable for any wrongful death in their hands. So that ultimately comes down to, right now, the police are the ones that are doing an investigation on themselves. So if you're having an investigation for yourself and you're having to put a grade for your own paper, what grade are you going to give yourself? Obviously, you're going to give yourself the best grade possible, and that kind of ultimately comes back to that whole idea. But we'll continue back. And I think that idea makes a whole bunch of sense, by the way. If you're going to do one thing about police reform and change one thing, definitely you need to have a way or a strategy or an idea of being able to have an investigation if a police officer does something wrong or if a group of police officers do something wrong, and have a approach on how you're going to fix that problem. That makes a whole lot of sense to me, and if you have to change one item or one idea, I think that would be the one thing I would pick, because it just makes no sense that you would be the one that is responsible for your investigation. This next one, set up civilian compliant review boards. Community oversight of police is crucial to establish greater accountability, and this is especially true in true in communities of color. In New York, New Jersey, a scratching Department of Justice report found that local police officers used executive force and violated the constitutional rights of New York residents. In response to Mayor Ross Barca issued an executive order to create a civilian compliant review board with the power to investigate and subpoena police officers. Civilian oversight boards are a great way to empower members of the community to seek their own evidence in case of police violence, and ultimately create a more transparent process. So that's kind of the same thing. It's slightly different because now you're relying on an oversight committee, and once again, we're going to get to a video where this guy kind of explains that process really well, and I think gives good reasons for it. But the more you have community support in your policing and community involvement in your local policing, the more the community is probably going to trust you, because you're kind of showing that you trust your community, you respect your community, and you do good things for your community. So it ultimately kind of comes down to that. So having community involvement, even in the police force, makes a lot of sense. Next one here. Provide racial bias training. The fact of the matter is that Black and Latino people face discrimination at all levels of the criminal justice system. Police officers should be required to explore how their implicit bias, unconscious procedures, and stereotypes may cause them to use violence against people of color disproportionately. There's no way racial bias training alone can get rid of racial discrimination in policing, but the only way to work against implicit violence is to raise awareness about it, and police chiefs should lead the way by offering racial bias training to their officers. Calls to implement these reforms have resonated from grassroots activists all the way up to the presidential race. Both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, for example, have made policy and criminal justice reform top priorities. So there's really not too much to say about that one, because I think we kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. But essentially, the idea that you're going to stereotype your one part of the population, even if it's statistically maybe accurate, still is not necessarily something I think you should be doing. And I'm not the best at really explaining that process, but including racial training, or at least pointing out that it might exist, or it does exist, or whatever you still might want to use for the buzzwords there, it just is a good idea. I don't really see a training module like this being a bad thing. So there's really not too much to say about that, because really I think every police force should have training on this, and probably even more training because of some recent events that happened within the police system. But we're going to get to... Oh, shoot. I deleted the article I wanted. Oh, well. I was going to read a little bit about... I forget exactly. I'll have to go back to my Discord to find that article, but... we'll just read about this book here. It was I have several academic journals, so we won't be too worried about that if you're an academic journal fan. So this is a book about police accountability, because once again, I think it ultimately comes down to how people view the police and the factor of how the police define themselves and how the community defines the police's role and the police's impact. Because if the police find their role and their impact and what the police are doing as good, or at least as being something that, as good, then you're ultimately going to have better instances of people trusting police and police trusting the community. Because once again, I think it ultimately comes back to those claims when you're trying to create a system of police. Because police, as I've said before, try to keep order and control the chaos factor that exists in people and the bad people and the good people and the conflicts that happen between the two. So I think most of America would say that there needs to be some sort of control and not a complete type of anarchy type of environment. But ultimately comes down to should this control be managed? How should people view the police? How should the police view the community? Does the police need to change? It comes down to those questions when you're talking about police reform. But we're going to go down to where it talks about that. We're going to go to 242. Page 242, gentlemen. 242. Where is the search? I found the search earlier. I don't want that. Yeah, let's try this. I don't know if this is going to be smart. 242. Oh no. Uh-oh. Sorry about that. I had this pulled up earlier, but I guess when I had to refresh the page before this stream, it didn't pull up. So I apologize for that. Looks like we're not going to be able to talk about this book. But sorry about that. I don't know why that decided to do that, but if you want to check out the book for yourself, I have the original link in my YouTube channel or in my Discord server, so you can definitely check out that book. And ultimately, it just provided a really good part about risk management and how police should view the community and how some numbers about police and kind of their role and how police should handle different perspectives, different ideas, and things like that. But we're going to get into our first video, and I was mentioning him a little bit earlier. This is Larry Lawton, I think. And he is a former convict and jewel thief. He has a YouTube channel, obviously, and he just hit over 1 million subscribers, I believe in 2019. Or sorry, not 2019. I believe in 2020. So it's a rather cool thing for him. But he was a former convict, and one of the big things he does, which is his business actually, is he tries to talk about how to educate the youth into what they should be doing, and almost kind of like not necessarily through fear, but through education. So people who aren't necessarily living the good life, he tries to show them their program and educate them just about what the jail is and how the jail treats you and these other type of ideas and perspectives to hopefully prevent you from doing these type of crimes in the future. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit to where he starts really talking about the major topics. And this was just after the death of George Floyd. So it's just, it's a very, very sad thing. And that's kind of why he's dressed up. And this is kind of more of a educated rant, I would call it. So if you're into that sort of thing, you can definitely check out the whole video. But we're going to get to kind of his major parts. But we'll start it right here and go from there.
And if you don't think they're racist, well, some of them are. Not all of them, but some of them are. The first thing they got to do is they got to hire the right people. They got to hire the right people. You know, let me give it. The cops are going to love what I'm going to say right now. Cops are not paid enough. They're not paid enough. We need to hire police officers, the right ones, and give them the salary they deserve. It should be. It disgusts me when I hear of a cop who's on food stamps, and I heard that. It disgusts me when I see a cop having to do another job. A cop should be all in up here with the right values to straighten this stuff out. We need cops who have values. That is the number one thing on my list. Hire the right people. Let me put it this way. I was talking to a guy who works with me who used to have 200 employees. And I asked him, I said, did you know who the mess ups were? He goes, yeah, eventually you know who the screw ups are. And what do? We either get rid of them, we give them retraining, we do something. Here's the problem. Cops know who the bad cops are, and they're not getting rid of the people who are bad cops. That's the problem. You could call it the code blue of silence or whatever bullcrap you want to call it, but the cops are not policing themselves. It showed it right here in this situation. You had 3 officers who could have stopped that cop and said, hey.
Explaining his perspective on George Floyd. And I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I'll let him kind of explain it for himself and give his own words, because I don't necessarily want to spoil it or kind of talk for him, because I want him to kind of say what he had to say. Even though it's through the video, I still think it's good to hear his perspective kind of as a whole, and I'll give my viewpoints of it. But ultimately, it comes down to what we read about in a previous article. And he definitely takes their perspective, as you just heard, in that if you want to reform the police, if you want to get the better reactions from the police or create a better police system, you need to make sure you get rid of the bad apples and the people that aren't doing the right thing. And he even saw through his example here where he asked one of his buds, and kind of what he referred to earlier and kind of used that as an example, is that the police know who the bad people are. It's like kind of like at your job. You know who the people who are just kind of phoning it in and don't necessarily respect their job or view their job in that good of a light. Every workforce has those type of people. And the same thing happens with police. So if you take his perspective, and his first way to end death by cops or to end police reform, or not really end police reform, but to have police reform, is the idea to get rid of the bad apples and to change this corrupt type of system. Now, I am going to let this video play because I have to run to the restroom real quick, but we'll let it kind of play out and give its perspectives, and I'll be right back.
Hey, get off his neck. Push him off the neck. What did they do? They let it happen right in front of him. I can't fathom to think that if I saw that going on, I wouldn't do something. I wouldn't do something. It blows me away that these 3 cops are not arrested. Because if I was in a crime, if they charged them with a crime, they charged them with a murder, or 3rd-degree murder, but they charged them with murder, and 3 cops are right around watching the 3rd-degree murder, you don't arrest them? What are you waiting for? And the longer you wait, the more distrust you have. Period. End of story. You know, the chief of police did the right thing. I'm going to say that. He fired 4 guys immediately. He saw the video, fired them. That's what we need. We need cops who make decisions. Now, he needs to get my program in there and get rid of the cops that don't belong in his department, because he has them. Obviously, he has them. So he needs to get the leadership behind him and the right kind of leadership. But the first thing is hiring the right kind of people. Values. The second thing is implementing community policing in the right way. You know, it really sickens me when I hear them say, we do community policing. They don't do community policing. They don't assign enough officers to community policing, specifically for community policing. Although every single cop should be community policing. Every single cop. You know, I live in a community that I can't tell you how many times. I live in Brevard County, Florida. And I can't tell you how many times I have people coming up to me telling me something the cops did to them. And I look and I shake my head and I say, what's wrong? And I asked them, did you go to somebody? Did you go to a sergeant? Yeah, and they told me to get out of here. How's that? Or they go to the office and nobody wants to review their complaint. They need a citizens group that a complaint can come to me and I can sit down with the chief and get an answer for that. Me. I will go to the police chief and recognize what the problem is and talk to that police chief and get that situation resolved and get that officer fired or retrained or whatever else we have to do to him. That's number one. Two is implement community policing. I have a community policing program. I have a community policing program that's used in some police departments. Others, I think they either just don't want to work with an ex-con or they're looking at me like, oh, you know, because I don't give a shit about the police. I don't kiss a police chief's ass. I don't kiss a sheriff's ass. Not going to happen. I'm not going to do it. I respect them as they respect me. Respect goes both ways. Just because you got 4 stars or a colonel's bar or whatever you wear on your emblem doesn't make me have to respect you any more than you have to respect me. That's the problem. Cops forget that they work for me. They work for you. Cops got to remember that. They are part of this community. And when they forget that, that's wrong. How do you not call? Listen, I call them and they don't call me back. Who are you? Blow them off? That's BS. That's what it is. It's BS. And it shouldn't happen. Community policing programs are the single most important thing a police department can do, and that's proven by numbers. Not SWAT departments. And I had a police chief friend of mine, and we debated this, and he said, I don't believe that chiefs of police should come out of the school resource officers. And I disagree with him, and I'll disagree with him right here in front of 1 million people. You're hiring these police chiefs who have all this SWAT experience and all this raid experience and multi-organization attack experience. You know what they all lack? Communication skills. Communication skills. That's the problem. They don't know how to talk to people. And that's wrong. You know what happens with a community policing officer? You know what happens with a resource officer? Forget Peterson down in Florida, Marjorie Stoneman does that. That's just a coward. Didn't belong to wear a uniform. You need police officers who know how to talk to people. And the reason I'm a police officer in Lake St. Louis, Missouri, is because the police chief there doesn't hire anybody unless they say they want to help the community. Did you hear what I just said? Not protect and serve, not get the bad guy. You might have to do that if it's part of helping the community. But if they don't say help the community, he doesn't hire them. Think of that, what I just said. He looks at it this way. Smartest guy, one of the best guys I know in the...
Uh-oh. Looks like it's buffering a little bit. We will pause it, let it catch up. Good time to kind of discuss what he's talking about here. So he's talking about communication with the community and with the police force really itself. And ultimately, if you want to create a system of better police, or just a system that is more going to give better results, is you want to make sure you have a good communication with your community, and you want to make sure, once again, that your community respects you and that you respect your community, because respect does go both ways. Although you are the force that keeps control, you are the force that arrests people, you are kind of the authoritarian type of style, you can still have an authoritarian style that works for the community, and community will still respect them, because it still comes down to perception. And if you want to change how people view the police, you have to first show that you are willing to change and that you have changed for the better. And as of right now, the police aren't really doing that, and it needs to happen for a lot of people for them to trust the police again. And he was mentioning that he feels women cops or lady cops have a better communication skills, and they're able to communicate with these people who commit these crimes or with the community, and just have better overall communication, and that's why we need to hire more of them. He didn't necessarily say that himself, but you can ultimately kind of get that perspective away with what he was saying there. And I do think that I agree also with him here, because communication is very vital to the success and to how people are going to view the police force, because it goes both directions.
And the present chief of police is amazing. They're the amazing crew, and that's why every instinct in my body wants to throw my badge away. Really does. But I won't, because of these guys. These are the kind of guys that I respect for law enforcement. That's why I do what I do. So why does he hire people like this? This is what he does. He says, Larry, he goes, when I sit them down, I know they can recite the law, do the stuff the bullshit academy does. When I ask them why they want to be a police officer in this city, if they don't say, I want to help the community, I don't hire them. Think of that. When I see a cop pass somebody who's pulled off on the side of the road, it bugs me. It bugs me hard. Unless that cop's going somewhere really important, he should stop and help that citizen. And I don't care if it's putting his lights on and waiting for the AAA truck or wait so nobody hits that person. I don't care what the cop's doing. That should be his priority. That's community policing at its best. Not giving out a bullshit ticket that don't mean anything on a road that's empty, or getting that extra DUI, or doing...
So he has a very good point, and this is one I kind of wanted to make sure would get communicated well. And also kind of how he views community policing, community policing as... how he views it as well. And it not just being better communication, not just trying to build respect within the community, but also viewing how you police differently. So instead of policing to get tickets, or to get speeding tickets, to get DUIs, to get whatever else, the police should rather take the perspective of helping the community first and protecting the community, obviously, but ultimately helping the community and doing things to build support with the community, and that will yield better results because people will be more willing to trust the police. People will see the police more in their community, because you can even argue that as someone who might be wanting to commit a crime, if you start to see the police within your community with like basketball games, or helping people more with tires, or whatever the situation might be, you might be a little bit more skeptical to actually commit your crime, because they are more in the community and more within how the community feels and everything like that. Maybe that's not true, but you could see that as being a potential to maybe even prevent crime in that way. But also just simply being more involved, you build up the perception of what the police are supposed to do, and ultimately you could turn the community's mind to seeing the police as good rather than being skeptical or maybe outright not liking the police. But we'll continue on.
Doing that extra BS that you do, come on, all you're doing is making enemies. The next thing they could do is training. Do you know why the military is so good? Because the military does nothing but train. They train, and they train again. We take cops, we put them through an 8-week academy, and in most of these small cities, they get put in a car and they go. Think of what I just said. They get put in a car and they say, you're on your own. Are you off your frickin' rockers? You're giving a 22-year-old kid the authority and power and the color of law to put somebody in handcuffs and take away their liberty? Are you kidding me? He's barely able to drink. You know, it sickens me to see that happen. And we need to train. We need to train, and we need to train. I wouldn't let a rookie cop in his own car for a year. I think he should have to ride with a senior guy for a year. Yeah, a year. Go on every different call. He should have to know everything about being a police officer from the right kind of people and the right kind of trainer. Not an asshole SWAT guy that wants to say, no, just shoot him. Or you get a sheriff that says, let's line him up. Let's go. We're tough. Shoot him. BS, guys. Why do you think you have such civil unrest? Because everybody knows that's wrong. And it is wrong, and it should be wrong. The next thing.
So before he gets into his next point, I do also agree with that claim. For sure, he ultimately does not like the approach of the police taking their perspective of, hey, we have the guns, hey, we have the power, look, we can use our power, and then ultimately use it. He takes the approach of more being civil with what you have. Yes, police do have guns, and yes, they are used to protect the community and to protect from someone shooting at them. But he takes the approach that the police should be shooting second, not shooting first. And I don't think anybody is really going to say, no, the police should be shooting first. No, the police should be killing these people. That doesn't make any sense. So, once again, I definitely agree with this perspective. And maybe hiring people of more diverse backgrounds or different backgrounds than just the type of SWAT sheriffs or SWAT chiefs or SWAT type of members, the approach that we should show up with force rather than we should show up with more skeptical use of force. But we'll continue on.
We need to use the right equipment the right way. What do I mean by that? Here's the right equipment. Body cameras. Body cameras are very important. But why shouldn't I see what the police see? Why are they held in such confidence? I don't get that. I don't get why I, as a citizen, who paid for that camera, let's get that fact right. I paid for that camera. Why we can't see the footage? Cops have dash cams. They shouldn't be allowed to take a guy out of the view of the dash cam, and they do it all the time. And they do it all the time because they know they're going to do something not right. And they don't want to be on the camera. You know, any cop that says to me, oh, I don't want to, if you don't want to be a film, then you're doing something wrong. Because you know what a camera does? Do you know what a body camera does? A body camera protects the good cop. So I or any other citizen can't come up and say, hey, this cop said this, or he did this. Body camera, baby. Body camera. But when your body camera's not working, when you do something and the complaint comes against you, but it's working on that other time, we got a problem. We got a serious problem. Equipment. How about taser guns? Equipment. How about batons, flashlights? How about your tongue and your mouth? It's called talking. It's called communication skills. They have zero.
So before he talks about this next point about communication, I just wanted to kind of talk about his first point about body cameras. We're going to watch another video where he kind of talks about this a little bit later, where he gives a little bit more detail on more about the defunding perspective of police on if we should defund rather than reform the police. And you ultimately might say that those are similar ideas or similar perspectives, but we don't necessarily have to get into that debate here. But it ultimately gives the perspective about body cameras and that they only help good cops and they only help for cops themselves. And he gives an example a little bit later of a shooting where the body camera would play a very crucial role in that. And I don't want to spoil that example for when we get to it. But ultimately, by having body cameras and having this technology, you are supporting the impact and your police force because you are backing it up with what is being seen. So if you're a cop that doesn't want a body camera, it is a little bit suspicious because it makes you think, well, what are you trying to hide, or what are you trying to not be as seen? Because you would ultimately, as a cop, you would think we want to have everything possible in your resources to do a situation and say, no, this is not what happened because I have this to show you that this isn't what happened. Because especially nowadays, people are more than willing to believe the victim instead of the cop.
Most cops don't. You know which cops do? Women. Women cops have less confrontation than men cops because they don't have an ego. They don't have that ego and that badge on their shoulder. They have the badge, they have the gun, but their whole life they learned how to use their tongue and they know how to communicate with people. That is a tool.
Oh, by the way, thanks for the follow, Clarista. Hopefully I didn't butcher your name there on Twitch. I'm sorry I didn't catch that earlier. For some reason, my notifications don't like to work with OBS most of the time. I'm hoping to fix that problem here in the future, but I'm just starting to get back into streaming more regularly now. So I'm sorry I didn't catch that earlier, but once again, thank you for the follow. I greatly appreciate that.
Tool that is not used enough. You know, they train them on shooting, they train them on being an expert, they train them on doing this, they train them on combat. All bullshit. Let me take a call. Listen, I'm an old man. I'd love to get some of these cops along because they think they're badasses. Come to my prison. Come to where I live for a while. Let's see how much of a badass you are. Because you'd be crying in the corner like a little pussy. Second, so that's the fourth thing. And the fifth thing is understanding how to use the media. Understanding how to use me, a social influencer. Understanding how to use YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. Understanding how to use CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, every one of them. Understanding how they work, how to use them. The police chiefs need training. The officers need training. And just, it boggles my mind. It boggles my mind how a cop is getting filmed today. They got to be the you know, it's like the old saying, if you go into a restaurant, you see a cockroach in the daytime or a mouse in the daytime, they got a bad infestation. Well, if you see cops willing to do what they did to this poor guy Floyd in the middle of the day with cameras rolling, how bad is that guy really? You know, when I see that, it boggles my mind. You know, it doesn't even show smarts that I'm going to hide what I'm doing. It blows me away. It really does, guys. So, if you're a cop out there, first of all, everybody watch it. I need your help. I need your help, and I want you to do me a favor.
So he's going to talk about his action thing he has, and you can join that. He has it on all of his YouTube videos, even the ones that aren't really as serious, because he does a lot of like gameplays or reviews of robberies, because he was a jewel thief himself, or a lot of prison stories and videos. But I just thought he had a very good video kind of easily breaking down 5 things that police could do to help build relationships with the community and to overall have a better impact for what we can do forward and ultimately create police reform or a different style of policing. And he is a very big fan of community policing and having the perspective that the police should be more active in their community and less active with trying to get speeding tickets and DUIs and things like that. Yes, DUIs are important to maintain less drunk driving, because drunk driving is a very bad issue. But I don't think necessarily that he takes drunk driving to be as serious as just trying to get, however many DUIs you need, but rather you should be more representative for your community and you should be more responsible for your community. So basically what I'm trying to say here is he takes the approach that yes, DUIs are important. Yes, you need to make sure that these arrests do happen and whatnot, because they are something that can lead to a lot of deaths and really can lead to more bad than good. But really, instead, you should be taking a much more community-based approach and build relationships with your community and with civil allies and whatever else you want to say, because that is ultimately going to lead to more good than just trying to reach your quotas for however many speeding tickets or DUI tickets you need. So I do think that is a very good point he was also having there. But we're going to get to our pro and con website here. And I always love using pro and con. They don't necessarily always have the most efficient results or points all the time. But anytime I get into debate type of topics or topics that have many perspectives, I always like to see what pro and con has to say, because it can show you kind of the two sides to the coin in a very easy format to understand. So we're going to look at some pro and con examples to police reform. So we're going to read a first pro, and then we're going to read our con point, and they normally talk about kind of the same sort of situation. So that's another good thing to kind of compare points on the good side and the bad side, because as I said earlier, whatever you read and whatever you learn, ultimately the most truthful things is in the middle. So if you read a CNN article and you read a Fox article, whatever is in the middle of what those two articles are saying is probably the truth. But we'll read our first point here. Pro 1. Police departments are historically oppressive and violent. Defunding them could reduce violence against people of color and overall crime. Paige Fernandez, MVP, policy advisor. Try to say that five times fast. I can't even say 5 times fast, 5 times fast. Woo-hoo. Anyway, American policing has been a neutral institution. The first U.S. city police department was a slave patrol, and modern police forces have directed opposition against violence at black people to enforce Jim Crow, wage the war on drugs, and crack down on protest. By the way, if Ron Helton's ever here, we definitely need to do a stream on war on drugs. Not that you necessarily have to be a guest, but I know you have a lot of things to say about that. But we'll continue on here. The police departments are also often outfitted with surplus military equipment, increasing police firepower and the attitude that police are at war with communities when they isolate situations to violence. So again, that talks about the perspective that the police have on a community. And it comes down to perception once again. If you change the perception, you change the idea, and you change how people see police and how people, how people see the police, you might be able to change violence and reduce crime rates. But we'll continue on here. Organizations such as MPD 150, which surveyed the Minneapolis Police Department, conducted since its inception in 1867, argue that the police system is actually not broken. It's working as it always has, because the police were established to protect the interests of the wealthy, and radicalized violence has always been a part of the mission. MPD 150 states that the police system puts millions of people in color and millions of people of color in prison, which limits or deprives them of voting rights, employment, education, and access to housing, among other privileges given automatically to white people. According to an August 20th, 2019 study, black American men are about 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than white men. Black women 1.4 times more likely than white women. A 2018 Bureau of Justice Statistics report shows police officers were twice as likely to use force against people of color than against white people. In 2019, U.S. police officers killed 1,098 people, 24% of whom were black, despite African Americans representing only 13% of the population. So anybody that's been familiar with politics and the political system and police reform or police brutality has heard of these numbers before. And I definitely have heard YouTubers and people talk about some FBI numbers that kind of don't think that these numbers are as truthful as they ultimately look to be. But at the same time, it's hard to necessarily agree with both, because I think that both statistics are valuable and both have their merits to them. So I just wanted to quickly address that, although it may not make too much sense in people who are listening, but I just kind of wanted to state that as kind of a conversation in my own mind as I read this. We'll go to our second point here, and this is the con point on what we just read. When police department budgets are cut, violence and civilian injuries increase, and department turn to taxation by citizen to raise money. Police officers in similar jurisdictions are those primarily populated by people of color are paid less. In Hillsdale, a suburb of St. Louis, Missouri, new officers earned $13.50 an hour. After a probationary period, less than hourly workers at Target. Low wages force many officers to take extra jobs, leaving them tired and unprepared to deal with high-stress police situations. David Harris, J.D., University of Pittsburgh law professor, stated, "We should not assume that the most proper paid cops are the worst cops, but the chances increase that you don't attract the best officers." During the 2008 recession, many police departments were forced to cut officials as federal funding decreased. In Memphis, use of force complaints almost doubled as officers, in an understaffed department were required to work overtime. In England and Wales, 2010 police budgets were cut, resulting in 2,592,000, 14% fewer officers in 2017, and 20% more gun, knife, and serious violent crimes. The homicide rates rose up to 39%. So ultimately, it will come down to the taxation argument here. Called citizen taxation, the department's taking a cut of each citizen rider is a common fund-raising strategy, such as tickets often cost residents more than expected. A $100 traffic ticket cost a California resident $100 in estate assessment fees, $70 in county assessment fees, and $50 in court constitution fees, $20 for emergency medical fees, among other fees, resulting in almost a $500 ticket for rolling through a red light. While no one wants to pay a $500 traffic violation, communities of color are especially hard hit and ill-equipped to pay such. So it's basically arguing if you take government funding away or alternative type of funding that police departments usually get, is going to come down to the people themselves having to pay the fee, and taxes are going to go up, and ticket prices are going to go up, and fees are going to go up, and blah, 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 because police are going to want to maintain the amount of money they have previously made or make more money than they could by taking it away. Basically, they're going to find a way to make the money they've lost back. Okay. This article is by American Friends Service Committee, and it states 6 ways why it's time to defund the police. First one, policing in the U.S. was established to maintain white supremacy. We've already read about that, so we'll go to our second one. Policing doesn't keep us safe. Despite the billions of dollars spent every year on policing, more than 15,000 people were killed by gun violence in 2019 alone. Disproportionately young people of color. If policing and imprisonment stopped violence, the U.S. would be the most peaceful country in the world. But decades of evidence show us that this is not the case. If we believe in everyone's right to live in safety and peace, we need to decimate our institutions that were never intended to get us there, and free up resources for solutions that are actually designed to create healthy, safe, and sustainable communities. And they quickly mentioned a point about justice reform, and I'm going to do a stream just on justice reform sometime next week, maybe this Monday, just depending on how things go, or this Monday being tomorrow, but depending on how things go with schooling assignments and such. But they ultimately mentioned justice reform and the fact that the U.S. incarcerates a lot of people, and disproportionately a lot of people of color. And it is something that a lot of people think is racially motivated, and if it's not racially motivated, then it's something very bizarre going on, something very bizarre going on. But they also bring up a very good point that police violence is still existing, and there's still a lot of crime in the United States. And although we have the police and we have a system and we have a lot of incarcerations and we have a lot of whatever example you want to use, you would think by having such a strong police force and such a strong prison system as far as how many people are in our prisons, we would be more safe. But this isn't really the world we live in, so it's a rather interesting thing. And I do think it comes down to the war on drugs and the fact that there is a lot of non-violent drug offenders that are in prison for their sentences. I don't know the exact percentage off the top of my head of non-violent drug offenders that make up the prison system, but I do know that the number itself, which I don't know off the top of my head either, but I have heard before, is an extremely high number. And just taking all of those non-violent drug offenders off the prison system or out of the prison system would drastically reduce the overall amount of people that make up our prison system now. But we'll save that topic for when we talk about the justice system. This is more about policing. So we'll go to our third point here. Body cameras, training, and other so-called reform measures will not end cycles of police violence. In Minneapolis and in other U.S. cities, body cameras and other reform measures were implemented as part of Obama's administration multi-million-dollar response to call for police accountability. Body cams are regularly shut off by police and do not result in less violent behavior, while increasing surveillance of those being policed. Trainings on implement bias for police have shown no discernible effect. In fact, in Chicago, it is found that officers accused of abuses were leading the training. Last one. Community policing. The idea that the police are... Community policing. The idea that if police and community work together, there would be more trust in the police doesn't work either. The practices disputes white and wealthy community members to surveillance their neighbors, resulting in even more police actions based on racist attitudes and beliefs. We're going to get into community policing at the end of our stream, and there's a lot of articles and data that suggest that claim not to be true, but I can't necessarily say that that claim is all false or is more false than not, because I do think that there is some truth to that claim, like many things. But we'll go to their fourth point here. Policing diverts billions of dollars from schools, healthcare, and other vital programs that need more funding to strengthen our communities and support shared well-being. U.S. cities collectively spend $100 billion a year on policing, while needed investments in education, healthcare, housing, and other critical programs go unfulfilled, particularly in poor communities and communities of color. New York City, for instance, spends more on policing than it does on departments of health, homeland services, housing preservation and development, and youth and community development combined. Our tax dollars must be relocated from the system that regularly murders black people for their impunity, I hope I said it right, and instead investigates in programs and strengthens our community. 5. Black Black organizers are called for divestment from policy and investment in human needs across the country. So this is kind of talking about Black Lives Matter and the No Ad campaign. Their 6th point here is our tax dollars should be invested in more humans than alternatives to policing. So this is kind of a interesting article because it takes the perspective that no matter what we do as far as trying to change the police system through reforming it, isn't going to ultimately lead to good results, and is just going to keep the system because maybe the system is so is so bad that the idea of being able to fix it is just not going to happen. And that could be the idea and that approach to kind of what this article is coming away from. And some people probably do view policing as being that way. But I don't necessarily think that that article is most productive or shares the style or the idea that we should be taking away from trying to change the policing system. Because ultimately, it's saying no matter what you do, you're still going to get the same results. So if you are someone that believes that, then you would think that the money would want to go elsewhere, as they were suggesting through maybe education or healthcare. So once again, if you do view those as policing and it's never going to change, and we spend way too much money on our police, then I could see someone saying, well, why don't we spend it on something else? Because, well, the system is so bad and there's no way that we are going to change it. So, I mean, I guess it does provide a different perspective, but I don't necessarily think that claim is too true. So it's hard to really say without. It's hard to agree with that article, but I could definitely see if you're someone that takes policing as being so systemic that you're never going to be able to fix it or change it or at least approve it, that you would want to take that money and spend it elsewhere. I definitely can see their perspective and their point there. This next one is an article that states here, Black Lives Matter police brutality in the era of COVID-19. We're going to go down a little bit to the section I wanted to talk about here. Right here. The modern institution of law enforcement in the United States is a relatively new concept. Prior to the abolition of American slavery, the institution of policing was either privately funded and employed part-time officers or was carried out by neighborhood actors/volunteers. However, during Reconstruction, many local sheriffs functioned in a way similar to the earlier slave patrols, enforcing segregation and disenfranchisement of freed slaves. The Wilkerson Commission in 1929 professionalized the institution of law enforcement, leading to the current state of modern policing. Police violence against the black community has multiple other health consequences besides death. In addition to the unsustainable and preventable black death caused by police brutality, living in minority communities with high concentration of use by force by police against pedestrians is associated with an increased risk of diabetes and obesity. Interesting. Many activists and protesters are advocating for policies that would bring less power to institution of law enforcement and more power to people who are currently live in over-policed communities. So it talks about how to stay engaged, but I just kind of wanted to read that because it wasn't really a point I necessarily wanted to think about. But if you're someone that is interested in COVID-19 and how law enforcement has kind of embraced COVID-19, taking for a more anti-law enforcement perspective, you can read this whole article here. And once again, these articles are linked in my YouTube channel at The Breakdown with Birkenhoff or on my Discord server, and you can join that on any of the links from wherever you're watching this live stream now or podcast if I decide to release it to my podcast. I'm going to check on my YouTube, make sure I haven't missed anything there. We're looking good on YouTube, so we'll continue on. This is by the ACLU, and I have read about the ACLU before, and I always have to state that when you read something like about from the ACLU, it takes a perspective that is much more left than anything else. So, as I've talked about before with mass media and when you're reading articles, you have to remember where you read your article from and the type of perspective and agenda they want you to pass away with. So, with knowing who the ACLU is, I definitely know what type of perspective and idea I am getting from this article, but I did think it would be interesting to read what they have to say about it from a perspective that thinks that police reform definitely needs to happen. But we'll go down. We'll go down to here. Alright. For example, Los Angeles budget gives police $3.14 billion out of the city's $10.5 billion spending on community service such as economic development, 30 million in housing, and 81 million pale in comparison to the massive LAPD budget. On Wednesday night, after years of Black Lives Matter grassroots activists demanding a cut in LAPD's budget, Los Angeles Mayor Eric announced he would cut $100 million to $150 million from the LAPD budget. and reinvest those funds into communities of color. Similarly, in New York City, the government spends almost $6 billion on policing, which is more than it does on Department of Health, Homeland Services, Housing Preservation and Development, and Youth and Community Development combined. By shrinking their massive budgets, we can help in decades of racially driven control and oppression, as well as address social pressures at the root, instead of investing in an institution that further oppresses and terrorizes communities. In addition to divesting from police and reinvesting in the savings and non-punitive programs that benefit public safety and health, there are other crucial steps we need to take foster the systemic change across the county, what we are calling for. And these were their changes. And this was kind of the main part of the article that I wanted to read here. And enforcement of minor offenses that drive street-level harassment. We could do this by repealing laws across the county that criminalize minor behaviors and passing laws that legislate activities such as marijuana possession and distribution. In the presence of police in schools, which exacerbate racial inequalities, puts immigrant students at risk of deportation, and limits opportunities accessible to low-income students. Develop mobile crisis service, peer crisis services, and crisis hotlines, and warm lines to support people who have a behavioral or mental health crisis. 4. Ban pretextual stops and content searches that act as common mechanics for police to engage in racial profiling and legal standards. 5. Implement common sense, civility, and criminally enforceable legal constraints so that there would be only rare instances in which officers are able to use force against community members. So they're ultimately taking the approach that, once again, police officers have way too much funding, and we need to restrict the amount of funding that police officers get and put this funding elsewhere. And the ACLU decides to put this funding elsewhere into mental health services and hotlines and things like that, instead of the other article we have read previously that wanted to invest more of this money towards education or health standards, or anyway, kind of the same similar thing, but they're taking the same point that the amount of money that these big cities receive, our police departments receive in general, is so much money, and this money can be spent in better places and used in better places than what we're using it now. Because if you take the approach, once again, of thinking that the police are ultimately all bad, and there's no way of changing the system, or at least the way policing works, there's not really a way to change it. Even if you have the best intent to change it, there's still not really a way to fix it. You should spend that money somewhere else and spend it better. It makes some sense to do that style of approach if you take that side of the spectrum. And as I've said before, I don't want to repeat myself too much here, but I can definitely see that whole perspective and that whole idea towards thinking about police reform. And I'll be interested to hear anyone who's maybe watching this now on any of my places where I'm live streaming or on the podcast when I upload it there, about your whole idea about police reform. Do you take that strategy? Do you think that there's a way to fix the police system and at least build trust with the community? Or do you think the system itself is so lost that the chance to ever rebuild the community or gain the community's trust again is not going to exist, and we should spend this money elsewhere? Because no matter what you think about it, there's a ton of money that gets used for policing and the needs of the police department and such. So if you decide that there's not really a way to fix this, and instead of spending this extra money on major armored vehicles or command centers or whatever else. We should spend this money on making a better education system or a better health care or mental health or whatever. I would be interested to hear kind of your approach to that as well. But we're going to read this next thing that is also about police funding. And I want to go down. We'll read the abstract, actually. We'll read the abstract. A number of civil rights activists have called for defunding and amalgamation of American police departments. We're going to increase this font. 1 second here. 1 second. I did it a little bit too much. Sorry about that. We'll go down a little bit. Got a little carried away. Come on. That way we can see it. Hopefully we get this thing. Alright, we gotta wait for it. That was a bad idea. Oh well. Come on. You can load. Suckers, come on. Alright, here we go. A number of civil rights activists have called for defunding or amalgamation of American police departments. These activists claim that the United States overinvests in police, leaving fewer scarce resources to support other government services. Activists also claim that overinvestment in policing contributes to higher rates of police misconduct and unnecessary criminalization, particularly in communities of color. This article considers these calls for defunding of police. It ultimately cautions against widespread defunding of police and offers an alternative proposal. Part 1 begins together multiple national databases on local government expenditures to evaluate impartially how states and municipalities fund policing. It shows the local police funding versus remarkably across jurisdictions. Much of the variation exists because of police departments derive funding primarily from local sales and property taxes. Because of this funding mechanism, economically, the disadvantaged communities are most in need of public safety services and can often least afford them. So this kind of comes back to the article and idea we read with the pro-con website, where it says that if you're going to get rid of these government grants and mass police funding that the government gives towards police, or these grants/companies give to the police, then the police are going to look elsewhere to try to find their needs to gain this money and to support the infrastructure they already have. Because even if the police are being the most trustworthy and being the most responsible with the money, if they have these command centers, if they have these armored vehicles, if they have these dash cameras, if they have whatever else, they're still going to have the money to be able to maintain these vehicles, maintain these cameras, maintain this technology, maintain whatever improvement they did under these massive grants. So, in order to do that, they're still going to need and have to receive a lot of money, and this money ultimately comes at great cost to the people. So, if you're trying to help communities of color, the idea of trying to tax these communities of color more are people who aren't able to have as good of income, then you're ultimately hurting the people you're trying to protect. And that's kind of what this article was talking about here and what we read in the pro-con. Because the police departments, even if they're being the most truthful, are still going to need enough money to be able to support their infrastructure that they already have. And ultimately, that's probably going to be more money than they would receive just from regular taxing if the government funds were to go away. But we'll continue on. Part 2 argues that defunding the police departments on a wide scale may have significant and unattained consequences. This article argues that defunding could increase crime rates, hamper effects to control officer misconduct, and reduce officer safety. Faced with similar budgets, defund agencies may also seek additional revenue through potentially harmful means like excessive ticketing, civil assist structures. Defunding could push the delivery of public safety services to the private sector, and defunding agencies may ultimately lower officer salaries, thereby limiting recruitment and retention of qualified personnel. So that would take the perspective of, if you say that police don't make enough, or maybe police need to make more, or at least maintain their salaries, the idea of lowering the police salary that many people think is already too low is extremely risky, because you're only going to attract people that maybe aren't necessarily as qualified. Because no matter what people think, the people who tend to be officers, or at least the better type of officers, are people that are looking to better the community and have that sense of public service to them. They're not necessarily there for the money. But at the same time, there still needs to be enough money if you're going to pursue being a cop full time to be able to support your family. So if you don't necessarily have a good enough budget for that, you could potentially be drawing the wrong type of people that want to be a police officer, so that they have the opportunity to have control over somebody, because it ultimately comes down to that as well. Many of the bad apples within the police system are people that simply just want to have the control. Maybe they got bullied back in high school or college, middle school, whatever it might have been, and they now want to have the opportunity to be that bully, so to speak. And that is extremely risky when it comes to policing. Last thing they mention here: given these drawbacks in the article, remain skeptical that defunding will improve policing in many jurisdictions. Instead, this article argues that states should fundamentally regenerate how they fund the police. States should view policing as public good that ought to be equally distributed across the population according to need, just as some state legislators have passed revenue-shrinking initiatives designed to equalize the availability of public goods such as education. So I thought that was a really interesting article, kind of talking about why we shouldn't defund the police, because ultimately the police still need enough money to serve their needs. And in the article it talked about some examples of that, but we're not ultimately looking for that, because we're going to get to some of those examples a little bit later with our next couple of articles. But we're going to bounce ahead here in this video, and once again we're going to be playing by Larry Lawton here, who was a former criminal, and now he's kind of has his own program where he basically educates younger people of bad influence, or people that have done kind of like a small crime, and try to educate them about the prison system and why you don't want to eventually do this major crime, because this is what reality looks like inside a prison. This is why you don't want to be here. But he's also been pushing really big for police reform, or at least trying to create a better type of police system. And I believe this video was recorded in response to the George Floyd incident and other incidents like that. But we'll play the video here.
Change. Because if you don't do that, you're just gonna, become a dictator, or a demagogue, or something that's so wrong. My mind's trying to stay without really getting off track. And I talked about money, and let me explain money, and let me explain defunding of the police. So many people have that word wrong. Oh, who you want to defund the police? You don't want police. That's not what it is, people. Defunding the police means stop the fucking spending of these police that is out of control. And you go, what do you mean, lad? We have a tight budget. We don't do. Listen, I went over a budget with the police department I live in, and I looked what they spend their confiscation funds on. And I'll tell you what, to credit to the chief of police, he told me straight up, Larry, after you had a meeting with the city manager and the council, I started looking at what we do, and I have changed. So I give him credit, because a lot of times it goes by them. They get a lot of money from governments, and there is money out there for every law enforcement agency out there. So let's not say there isn't. It's not a money issue. You want cameras, you'll get money for cameras. Trust me, the federal government will give you money under the COPS program, which is Community-Oriented Policing Services. A lot of other ways to get money for positive law enforcement change. So you got to think outside the box. That's why you're a chief. You're not a chief because you just stayed in the department and you didn't get in trouble. You're a chief so you have, hopefully innovative ways of thinking and changing things, and positive leadership to bring the community forward. So, money, money, money. What do I mean by defunding the police? Let me tell you exactly what I mean by that. You know, when you see a police department with a military command center, I ask, why do you need that command center? How many times a year do you use that command center? And I mean really use that command center. If you use it I don't think you use it one time a year, twice a year. What'd you pay for that? $1 million? How much maintenance is on that vehicle? How many people have to be trained in that vehicle? Way too many. When they say defund the police, how about take the money you spent on that vehicle? However you got it. I don't want to hear about, I didn't pay. Oh, you know, you see these departments that get vehicles from the military. And they go, oh, we didn't pay for them. They were giving us the free. Well, man hours is not free. Maintenance is not free. Training is not free. So stop the bullshit that it's free. You know, my dad used to tell me, he goes, son, there's nothing free in this world. And my dad was right. Well,
I thought that was a very good point he had, and that's why I kind of wanted to play the whole portion of his point before I cut it off and kind of said my perspective and bounce to the next part of the video I want to play for this time. But he's not a fan of defunding the police entirely, but rather reallocating the money or using the money better. And I also mentioned the same example a little bit earlier in the video, that not every county needs these command centers or needs these armored vehicles. Counties can share these armored vehicles and share these command centers, and maybe even be combined budgets or combined committees or whatever you want to say, to make sure that everybody has the equal portion of that command center or vehicle, instead of everybody having one of each, or having a command center or having an armored vehicle, whatever example you want to necessarily use. So I think his example on that was also very solid and very good, and I also mentioned it earlier as well. But I just thought I would quickly bring that up as well before we play this next part of the vehicle. And this is also another claim that I brought up before, but I just want to you guys to hear it from him as well, because he explains this very well and puts it in. Yeah, he explains it very well.
Citizens Review Board, where a ex-con can call me and say, hey, Larry, man, this cop did this, this, and this to me. I'll look into it. I'll weed out the bullshit or not. I'll give him some help. And then I go to the one who brought it, so the cop don't even know who did it. And they might figure it out. And if they're caught to be any kind of retribution, again, that cop's got to go. Because one of the biggest problems cops have is they don't police themselves. I say this all the time. In law enforcement, in any profession, my profession, or the Walmart, or the office building, or the doctor's office. Let me ask you a question. Do you know who the shitty employee is? Do you know who the guy who steals little pencils or does shit? Do you know the guy who's the slacker, who's always outside smoking and when he should have been working, and taking off time when he shouldn't, and asking somebody to switch his time card? Everybody knows those people. Well, law enforcement knows it too. They know who the assholes are. Trust me, they know who the assholes are. The problem is they don't want to out them. So we need to change the whole culture of how law enforcement polices itself. And that's unions and everything. But a lot cops need to police themselves, period. Because until they do, nobody's going to trust them. Because you know what happens? Right down the road, there's a cop. I know he smokes weed. I don't give a shit. But now he's out busting a kid for weed. How does that look? Now everybody in this community knows he does. How does that look? Think about what I just said. You know, not that a cop, and again, I'm going to get back to that. It goes back to that hiring practice. I don't give a shit if the cop, every cop should smoke weed, know what it's like and feels and everything else, to be honest with you. That lily white dude that is perfect and all that bullshit, to me, is a shitty cop. I want the cop who knows street smart cop, knows what's really important. That's the kind of cops we need. Well,
so he talks a little bit later, and if you want to watch that whole video yourself, because he explains a lot of those points in really large detail, especially if you listen to the earlier video. This was kind of a extension from that earlier video where he explained some of his 5 points to police reform in a little bit more detail. But you can find any of those videos on Larry Larton's channel directly, or you could go to my YouTube where I have those videos in my description of this video, or join my Discord server, and I have all of my articles linked in my server directly there if you want to check those out and maybe listen to the video yourself. But we'll go to our next part, and these last 3 articles is about community-oriented policing, because ultimately when I was doing my research before I started this, I was like, okay, this is a topic that I'm seeing a lot of come up in throughout this discussion and research and whatnot. And I decided, well, let me take a look at community-oriented policing and see exactly what it is in detail, and then if it's effective or not. And we read a little bit earlier on the article that said that it's not effective because it still has the same crime rates or whatever that examples were in particular. It's still interesting to hear an alternative viewpoint to that same concept here. But we'll read this from here. Benefits of a community policing a collaborative approach. To define it simply, community-oriented policing is a strategy that enables police departments to partner directly with the community or productively address public safety concerns. Unlike a rapid response system, community policing methods aim to lower crime rates by engaging members of the community to help identify crimes or potential public safety issues that might have otherwise gone unnoticed by law enforcement. The purpose of community policing is to build ties with the community, enhance trust in the police department, and better promote a crime-free future instead of simply reacting to crimes in progress. Community policing methods aim to proactively suppress the conditions that enable crimes before they arise. Due to this, law enforcement agencies employ a number of community policing tactics, including scheduling regular consultants with local residents, decentralizing authority by giving discern to individual police officers, and deploying citizen foot patrols in place of regular police patrols. Since the passage of Public Safety, Partnership and Community Policing Act of 1994, the U.S. has seen a marked increase in the number of community policing operations. A majority of police departments in the U.S. now have some form of community policing in place. Research shows that when successfully implemented, community policing can lower crime rates in target areas, reduce public mistrust, and increase cooperation between law enforcement and communities they serve. So then the question becomes, how are you supposed to ultimately use community policing? Because the idea seems to be smart, because the more you involve your community, once again, the more your community is probably going to trust you, and the more the community trust you, the more responsible you're probably going to be. It ultimately comes down to respect goes both ways, as I've said many times throughout this stream. But if this idea is so simple and this idea has shown to be effective, then you would think that every police department would want to have community policing. So there's obviously some reasons why police departments don't have it, or some weaknesses to community policing. And it is what one article mentioned earlier on saying that it ultimately comes down to people in the community trying to not necessarily hunt to find the crime, but at least report when they see something. And it still targets minorities, or it still doesn't really help the situation because you're ultimately kind of still doing the same thing. It just may not be from the police directly. So it's a rather interesting claim. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what this article talks about and how to do these challenges and how to do community policing as a solution if it's something that ultimately works. So we'll see what they have to say about that. Community policing methods require a high degree of collaboration between area business owners, residents, and law enforcement agencies. And in underdeserved communities where community policing may have the most to offer. However, there are a few hurdles to cross to ensure this level of collaboration is possible. Hello there, Oi and your mom. That is an interesting name there. I have to say it's pretty funny. Hopefully you're having a good night or day wherever you're listening to. Basically, this stream's on... Right now it's on community policing, but we were talking earlier about police reform and the whole concepts about that. So I was asking everybody this question, and I guess I can ask you now, about your perspective on your perspective on police reform. Do you think that the way policing is done in the United States, or maybe wherever you live, is good enough to change the system and to gain trust back from its citizens? Because I don't think a lot of citizens trust the police as much as they did before George Floyd, and even really before. You can go way back to like the LA riots, back when the racial profiling started to get much bigger in the United States. So basically I've been asking everybody's question: do you think that the police can gain back everyone's trust through trying to reform police, maybe through this community policing style? Or do you think we've gone so far that the idea of trying to do that is never going to happen again? Is it a lost cause, basically, at this point? And it's good that you're doing well. That is a very good thing. I'm not looking forward to tomorrow and having to start the week over again, but at least I'm having to do this. It's been a pretty fun stream so far. Anyway, we'll continue. Departments are often strapped for officers, so time is scarce and the geographical areas they cover may be too large to efficiently address all community concerns. The length of officers' assignments may also be too short to allow them to become familiar with and establish relationships with local communities. Finally, many agencies lack infrastructure and mechanics necessary to invest in new policy procedures. Law enforcement agencies need a low, cost-effective, and efficient way to incorporate community information and build trust with the residents they serve. This is why technology can help. Integrating seamless communication tools into community policing methods can give citizens a voice while also keeping officers in the know. Cool Fire's purpose-built community app can serve as an intuitive, man, I'm struggling reading now, multiple space for citizens to report suspicious behavior or request for an officer to perform a home check. Real quick, I don't know if I necessarily like what they're saying here. The idea of community policing does seem like an interesting idea and an interesting concept if you're trying to make a system of trust, because, as I've said many times, respect goes both ways. And if the police are able to build respect from the community, and the community is then able to trust the police, then once again you have respect of the police, and you have a system that is ultimately going to work, and is something that is good rather than bad. But the perspective that Cool Fire is talking about here with this article on trying to implement a policing system, a policing idea of community policing, and basically the idea that your neighbor can call the cops if they see, somebody passing drugs or distributing drugs or maybe a knife attack or something. Like, obviously you have your instances where the neighbor calling 911 makes sense because that's already being done now. But the idea that you're just going to have someone kind of driving in their car looking for potential crime and then calling in this potential crime is a little bit weird. It ultimately kind of creates this Karen type of feel to me. I don't know if you necessarily want this Karen type of person to control the police system in this way, at least by the way that they're describing it in this article. I'm in your mom says, well, I can tell you this now. I do not support BLM, and a lot of people don't like context, and a lot of killings these people caused it. Like Jacob Blake, he was resisting arrest and was a criminal. Yeah, the Jacob Blake case is a real interesting one. I don't think that. Now, you didn't mention George Floyd, but I do think that George Floyd and the reason the protests happened from that are were, I don't want to say the peaceful protests were justified. Now, obviously, the protests that happened with looting and all of that was something that should have never happened, really, because I even think people within that peaceful protesting community were still looking at that and going, really, guys, you had to do this? Don't do that. Anyway. So I understand the concept of peaceful protesting, and I definitely understand it with what happened with George Floyd. Now, when you talk about Jacob Blake is one of the really interesting ones that happened in recent history. And at first, the media covered the story, and it wasn't anything like a George Floyd where you saw the cop on him for like 8 minutes or whatever. But from the very first video you saw and from the very first media coverage of it, you would think that this incident was absolutely horrible. But as more information has come out, the more the situation is looking less and less like the video showed or how the media first covered it. And Jacob Blake recently did an interview. I believe it was Good Morning America. It was one of those companies. Not the same chick, but the person who introduced him was the same chick who interviewed Jesse Smollett during his whole adventure he had, like 2 years ago now? Maybe last year. I can't remember when that happened. Anyway, but it was that same company there. But they interviewed Jacob Blake, and he mentioned that he was armed because he was going back for his knife, and that's probably why he got shot, because the police didn't want that to happen. And at that point, he already took a whole bunch of tasers and everything else. And he did have criminal history and whatnot. So the more information you learn, the more skeptical the whole Jacob Blake incident really is. Now, could the cops have done better, and could the cops have not have shot Jacob Blake and maybe done something else? Maybe, but the whole idea that he was shot for just being black doesn't really seem to be as true as it first appeared to be, as more facts come out. And Actual Justice Warrior is a YouTube channel, and he did a really good couple of videos about Jacob Blake. Now, I don't agree with everything he has to say about Jacob Blake and the whole incident, what happened, but he definitely takes a very good perspective about from a justice, because he's a criminal justice major. He takes a very justice type of law perspective where he looks into it and says, well, this is kind of what happened from a law perspective and whatnot. Peaceful protest you're all for? Yeah, I think everybody is for peaceful protests. I don't think I've ever met someone that didn't support peaceful protests. But I don't think if you're for looting and violence and things like that, you're a little bit more extreme. And I haven't really met anyone that's for all that. You also say, I think it's great even though I don't support it. People don't like information. Are you left or right? That's a complex question. I would say that I'm definitely more in the middle now than I ever used to be, really. I was pretty hardcore conservative a couple years ago, and now that I've learned more about politics, the more I'm leaning a little bit more differently. But right now, if I had to pick a party, I would probably pick Libertarian Party, because I definitely agree with almost everything about their party platform. I don't necessarily like the LP party and everything being the main party, more like the Texas LP or the Florida LP. I tend to agree with more of their stances a little bit more. But I definitely am for liberty. I'm definitely for those type of concepts. And I don't really necessarily... we can get into that on a separate thing, but that's kind of where I stand now. But I'm definitely not Democrat, and I don't really consider myself Republican either, so I'm somewhere kind of in between, because I don't really agree with many of their stances from the national policies. Patromon, I don't know if I said your name right. I butchered all names all the time. Anyway, I believe the difference in police prevailing response was highlighted in the response to peaceful BLM protests and an attack at the Capitol. Then, and your mom says, and you're for the looting and stuff, you're probably Antifa. Politics is complicated. Yeah, Antifa is an interesting movement in itself, because they are definitely the ones that were, they were definitely responsible for some of the looting. They may have not have caused all of the looting by any means, but they definitely had their fair share. But a funny thing about anarchy movement as a whole is there's this whole sub-unit of anarchy, of anarchist people that exist, that are professors, are people that are more educated and don't necessarily take the approach of trying to change fascism or trying to change through violence, but rather trying to change through education. And I did a documentary analysis on my YouTube channel about that. It was called The Monopoly on Violence. But it was very interesting to see this whole different type of anarchy, because I only knew anarchy really from Antifa. So the idea that there's people who are anarchists that don't like Antifa was rather interesting to me. Pat says, I'm just gonna call you Pat, I'm sorry for that. If you are for beating cops to death, you are probably all right. Oi says, I am hardcore right, like I support ALM, black, the blue, all of that. Yeah, I'm definitely not all hardcore right by any means, I would say. Like I said earlier, I don't know if I really support any mainstream policy that much. I take a few from each, I would probably say, if I had to pick. But if I had to pick a mainstream party, it would probably be the Libertarian Party. And you might say, well, that's not really mainstream. But hey, it is the biggest third party, so. But, yeah, I definitely kind of agree with what you're saying there, Pat. It's like I was saying a little bit earlier. It's ultimately the concept of police and how you view the police system and how that goes. Because, as I said before, respect kind of goes both ways. So ultimately, you have to build up this respect, and you have to have this respect build up from the community and then the police. And if you have respect go both ways, and people feel like they're safe, and the police feel like they're don't have to prove themselves, or whatever you might say, then you're probably going to have a better overall system. But since I have both of y'all here, I'll go ahead and ask this question earlier that I've asked people who've come by the stream throughout, is, do you think that police reform and the idea of maybe defunding the police, or let's just keep it to police reform, do you think the idea of reforming the police and changing the police so that they become more supportive from the community, or people tend to trust the police more than they don't trust the police, or people of color don't automatically think that the police are out to get them or bad, whatever example you want to use, do you think that the police are through reform have a chance of changing the respect from their citizens and the citizens trusting them again? Or do you think the whole police unit and the whole way we see police today is so far gone that any idea of police reform isn't really going to happen, and people are simply just not going to trust the police anymore? So that's kind of the question I've been asking people throughout the day. I know the question's kind of long. I probably should have summarized it a little bit, but I kind of wanted to say the whole thing, and you could pick any part of the tree from that question you want. But we'll continue to this next academic journal here. Accessing the impact of community-oriented policing on arrest, and this is the abstract. Community-oriented policing, COPS, influence and effect on policing has been significant in recent years, with evidence suggesting that it increases police satisfaction, particularly improves police legitimacy, and reduces citizens' fear of the crime. It has also been hypothesized to influence the likelihood of an arrest. However, this possibility presents completely theoretical mechanics and limited empirical assessment. The current study uses multiple analytical approach to merge data from the National Incident-Based Reporting System database, which with the information from the Law Enforcement Manager Administrative Statistics Survey to investigate the possibility. Results indicate the agencies engaged in greater and specific COP activities experience an increased likelihood of an arrest in a violent crime incidents. This effect varies by the type of violent crime and the amount of COP actively undertaken. I see some comments here from Pat, and Pat states, if you are beating cops to death, I already read that. I believe it depends on a particular precinct. Some may be able to be reformed. Others may need to be completely replaced. I believe the relationship between DAs and cops need to be better separated and completely eliminated when it comes to campaign contributions. Hello, are you a dim socialist from CGen? No, I am not a dim socialist. I identify myself, as I said a little bit earlier, as more of a libertarian. I kind of take both perspectives from both points from I take some policy ideas from the right and some policy ideas from the left, but if I had to pick a mainstream party, I would probably say that I'm more libertarian. CGN says, okay, would you mind monitoring a debate? Well, I don't know if your debate's right now, but if it's in the future, I might be able to do that depending on my school projects and whatnot. I wouldn't mind doing that if it's in the future. But going back to Pat's comments about separated DAs and cops, I do think that that's a very, very good point, because ultimately it comes down to the relationship. And as we were saying earlier, is right now how the police system works is if something bad happens, the cops are the ones that investigate themselves. So the idea that the cops are going to give themselves a bad grade doesn't make much sense. I compared it earlier to a student, because I'm a student now. If I were to write a paper and give it to the teacher's the woman that looks at this paper, reads it, and then puts a grade on this paper. And that's how it's kind of supposed to work. But if it was the police system and you now put it into the schooling ward, I would write this paper and put my own grade on it. So I could basically take whatever paragraphs I want from Wikipedia or some sort of alternative website and put it down on my paper and just completely plagiarize whatever I want, and then put 100% and say, yes, I deserved 100%. This is the best paper I've ever written, when it could just be complete garbage and not even make any sense, because I'm allowed to put whatever grade I want on that paper. It's the same thing that kind of happens with the police and how the police work. Is the police are the only ones that do the investigation on themselves. The idea that they're going to give them a bad grade or want to change the system if something completely is wrong doesn't particularly make much sense. Now, maybe you'll have the honest person that does do an honest grade and say, look, I wrote this paper, but really I think I deserve an 80, not, whatever, and put an accurate grade on their paper. But again, you're kind of talking about a little bit craziness here, so I do agree with that point. And about campaign finances, I agree with that point as well. I had a conversation with my co-host when we do our stream on Thursday, and we had one over money in politics. And we didn't necessarily talk about DAs necessarily, but it could still be used for that example. Essentially, the money in politics is just such a corrupt system within itself. And the idea that these cops and DAs and chiefs and DAs work together in the way they do can lead to a lot of corruption, because essentially they want to both do good, and sometimes for them to both do good they can work together, and the closer they work together the better off they might be. And it definitely, the way the police system works today, it leads itself to that perspective. But to your earlier comment about that you believe it's certain precincts, I do agree with you as well. It's hard to play with absolutes. I don't think that you could say, well, for every precinct or every county or whatever word you want to use, the worse off it gets, and there's no way police is going to help. Or you could say the opposite and say, where whatever you do with reform, it's going to work because blah, 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 and give these reasons. I do think it is going to depend on a very local type of basis. So I do also agree with you there. And I do think that there are definitely some precincts or some counties that would be able to adapt some of these reform strategies and end up better for their community and end up better for themselves. But we're going to go down to some of the data in the example, and we'll go to our next and last article here. We want to go to our results. Good thing about this one is we can skip around. I like this format. Anyway, all descriptive statistics are reported in tables. Level 1 and 2, Level 2. These tables provide a basic description of all variables and arrests occurred in 44.8% of all violent crime incidents. The majority of incidents involved in simple arrests, 70.6%, were female victims only, 56.8%, and some from a form of injury, 53.7%. By the way, this is in reference to the community policing and some statistics and numbers they got from the community policing, just in case if we forgot what these were about. The average victim was roughly 30 years of age, and incidents primarily involved white, 49.4%, are black, 38.9% victims only. Offenders known to the victim, 82.6%. Male offenders, 72.3%, and black offenders, 47.4%, were arrested in the majority of incidents. On average, offenders were roughly 30 years of age, with a small percentage under the influence of alcohol or drugs, 13.2%. Incidents were mostly frequently entitled in private locations, 65.4%, between the hours of 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. Organizational characteristics varied considerably with regard to demographics. On average, male officers were most common, 91.6%, and the representation of black officers were small, 4.9%. Over 80% of agencies required high school as a minimum education requirement for employment. Agency capacity to respond to violent crimes varied as agencies. On average, employed 167 full-time individuals handled roughly 4% of crimes incidents per full-time sworn officer. Woo! Okay, that's a lot of information. So as you can see, they got a whole bunch of statistics there, from demographics, from racial demographics to age demographics and whatnot. But let's get to kind of what they conclude with all of these results here, and ultimately if community policing is the right sort of perspective to have. COP aims to broadly change the perception and actively functionally of the police from a reactive crime fighters to proactive, engaged partners with the community. This is a daunting proposition that scholars have noted is incredibly difficult. Strong evaluated work has undertaken to explore the impact of this change, and the current study offers a small contribution to this effort by focusing on arrest. COP activists can affect the likelihood of arrest, but this is important for agencies to take targeted actions and consider that these steps may be more or less useful depending on the nature of the crime. Overall, these findings suggest that those benefits for organizations adapting COP as a philosophy, but as many social procedures, these are nuances that need to be considered. So ultimately, the idea of community policing is a hard thing to accomplish. Not that it can't be accomplished, but it ultimately is a lot harder to accomplish than one might think. Now we'll get to our last article I have up here, where it talks about the influence of community policing was a rather interesting thing, because if you can change the overall behavior and the likelihood of someone maybe to commit a crime to community policing, then I could definitely see a strategy behind this. And just for everybody who's here now, since we have a little bit more people, these articles can be found on my YouTube channel, The Breakdown with Birkenhoff, or on my Discord server. So if you join any one of those, you can find these articles if you wanted to read it yourself or know when I go live or anything like that. But we'll read the abstract here. The research examines the influence of community-oriented policing on crime reporting behaviors. The study's data consist of incidents of violence obtained from the area identified as National Crime Victimization Survey that were linked to the city-level measures of police involvement in COP. Multinational logistic registration analysis reveals that although third-party police notification is more likely in cities with large numbers of full-time COP officers, victims residing in such cities are significantly less likely to report police than they are to report non-police officials. However, in cities where the training of police officers in COP is rarely extensive, victims demonstrate preference for police notification. reflective to both non-police notification and non-reporting. Lastly, multiplicative models indicate that police involvement in COP has less of an influence on the reporting behaviors residentially unstable victims who lack social ties to the communities in which they reside. So we'll get into some of the results and we'll read our conclusion just like before. Descriptive statistics for the sample of 2,379 assaults and robbery incidents are reported in Table 2. Consistent with prior studies, unreported incidents comprise nearly half, 46.83% of the assault and robbery incidents, and are the model category for an indicator of crime reporting behavior. Approximately 31% of the study indicates were reported by the victim of police. 12% were reported by police by non-household third parties, and the remaining 10% were reported by victims of non-police officials. Descriptive statistics for the city indicators of police involvement in COP illustrate that the typical city, 9% of police officers were additionally designed as full-time community-oriented police officers. In addition, the typical city's force divided 86% of police recruits and 71% of recruit officials with training on COP. In regards to the extent that police officials involve citizens in the community, policing efforts, approximately 80% of citizens in a typical city were served by police agency that targeted citizens in COP. So we'll go over to our conclusion here. The findings reported in the study reveal that some facets of police involvement in community-oriented policing influence the nature of citizens' crimes reporting behaviors. However, the ways in which various manifestations of COP influence reporting are mixed. For instance, in cities where a large proportion of current officers are trained in COP, the likelihood of both victim and third-party police notification tends to be higher. However, in cities with a relatively large percentage of full-time COP officers, victims of assault and robbery are either less likely or less capable of notifying the police and instead rely more heavily on non-police officials as targets as crime reports. Perhaps attributed to unmeasured differences in officers, the organization attitudes about COP, a more thorough understanding of those will require future research and access. So even on this article where they tried to determine behavior, there were some statistics and analysis that support this idea and support that there may be some reasons to do the approach of to implement the COP procedures of community-oriented policing. But there isn't that much data necessarily to back that fully now, so it becomes a little bit interesting when you look at it because there's not enough data to fully support the idea of community-oriented policing. But if you think about it from I guess you could say a logical perspective, it might make sense to implement more of a community-oriented policing strategy than not to, even if it's an idea of trying to observe that through just a purely through the route of what you could see from a more cultural aspect. Because ultimately what you're trying to do by reforming police is change the cultural identity and how people view the police. Because if you can change how people see police and how people view the police and make it a better result and make people maybe still fearful of police but not necessarily fear for their life, it would maybe change a little bit better for results and things like that. So that's kind of all I have for my articles for today's stream. And CJN, if you're still here, you can definitely join my Discord and talk to me there about maybe moderating your debate depending on the day. Or you can whisper me here on Twitch and I'll make sure to talk to you there if you're still here. I definitely can do that for you if I have the time and everything like that. But I definitely appreciate everybody who stopped by. And I do have a Trovo account now. So if anybody has Trovo, you can join me there at the Breakdown with WB. I just made it literally before the stream today. So it's rather interesting on that note. But I'm going to end the stream here today. And thank you, everybody who joined past. Thank you, Clarista. I'm sorry for butchering that. For the follow earlier today. Thank you, Oi in your mom. And Patronon. And Alt-Right, apparently. And Tricker Butters for your comments on Twitch and joining me there. I highly appreciate all of your comments and support, and even watching my stream. Thank you very much for that. But I'm going to end the stream here for today. I hope you enjoyed what you heard, and I'll catch you on my next stream. I might be streaming on Monday for justice reform, but I'm not completely certain about that topic as of yet. So you'll have to bear with me on that one, depending on how schooling goes and everything like that. But we're going to head out of here. Once again, thank you everybody for stopping by, and